All right, well, I know we still have one or two folks making their way in, but let's dive in if we can. I want to introduce quickly to you, you have their bios as well, Phil Gorski and Jamar Tisby, who'll be talking about Christian nationalism to sort of start us off today. Phil Gorski is a Robert Bella mentee, did his doctorate at Berkeley, but spent time with Bella and has talked a little bit about Kristen Kobus-Dumay in recent talks, who was here last year. At this same time, he's a professor of sociology at Yale, where he chairs a department. He co-directs the school's Religion and Politics Colloquium and also co-directs the Center for Comparative Research. He focuses on all the big questions, long-term sort of state formation, nationalism, revolution, economic development, secularism, with a particular attention to the intersection between religion and politics. He has authored, by my count, 10 books, if you count them all, including the edited ones. A lot of books, but most recently, The Flag and the Cross, White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to American Democracy, Oxford Press in 22 with Sam Perry. Also titles like American Babylon, American Covenant, Civil Religion from the Puritans to the Present, Post-Secular in Question, The Protestant Ethic Revisited, Max Weber's Economy and Society, Critical Companion, all with wonderful publications, publishing houses. So it's a real honor to have him. He's going to start for about 25 minutes, and then we're going to hear from Jamar Tisby, who's the author of 3 books, notably the first, The Color of Compromise, The Truth about American Church's Complicity in Racism, from 2019. He's more recently authored How to Fight Racism in 21, and a new volume, The 3 Colors of Compromise. And he's got a fascinating bio, and I just want to give you a snippet in case you haven't seen it online. He basically has a story that feels like it's still unfolding as a theologian. He attended Catholic school growing up, accepts Christ at a evangelical church youth retreat, goes to Notre Dame, is the sole black congregant in a Reformed church, sort of evangelical church, plugs in with the North Lawndale community in Chicago, focused on social justice and poverty issues, and does Teach for America in Arkansas, considering sort of eventually the Reformed Seminary in Jackson, Mississippi, always interested in the big questions, the big social questions. After the death of Mike Brown in 2014, feels like there's some unsatisfactory answers that are being given, pushback to Black Lives Matter, so he enrolls in a history course at Jackson State. Then he goes to a PhD program at Mississippi State. Sort of the trends worsen during the Trump years. Prefers sort of to the running of a center at BU, activism and leadership. And so following the best of Yale's sociology department, we'll hear a second from Jamar about a sort of dream that's still unfolding. Thank you both for coming. Phil, welcome to Faith Angle, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks for that introduction, Josh, and thank you to Faith Angle Forum for inviting me here. I thought I would give my presentation in the form of a set of answers to questions and objections that I often hear when talking about white Christian nationalism. And so one is that it's just a smear aimed at conservative Christians, and that it's a concept that is nowhere defined. It certainly is true that Christian nationalism, as it sort of entered into our public discourse and began to circulate outside of the academic seminar room, that it does sometimes get used as a sort of umbrella term by some folks on the left for anything that we don't particularly like, much in the way that socialism used to get tossed around by the right and now wokeism does. But it certainly is not the case that there are no definitions. There's a pretty substantial literature out there now on white Christian nationalism and a variety of relatively clear definitions. I thought I'd begin then by just offering one of the definitions that we develop in the book, and this is white Christian nationalism as a political vision for the United States. And what one finds here, if you begin to investigate this empirically, looking at public opinion, is that white Christian nationalism, as we define it there, is associated with a variety of different views, with a variety of different policy views. We measure it with a battery of questions that ask respondents about their sense of the place of Christianity as a most obviously, should the United States be declared a Christian nation? What do you think about the separation of church and state? A variety of questions like that. And you find then that it's robustly correlated with a variety of different things. So opposition to regulation of guns, regulation of the economy, opposition to immigration, for example. This raises, I suppose, another question that people often ask, which is, well, in what sense is this Christian? I'll defer a theological answer to somebody who actually has some credentials, but we take it as Christian in two senses. One, many of the people who think of themselves as Christian nationalists or affirm Christian nationalist beliefs identify as Christians, and we simply take their self-identification at face value. But there's also a deeper reason for thinking about white Christian nationalism as, in some sense, Christian, and that is that it draws on a particular Christian interpretation of Scripture. And we talk about this as the deep story of white Christian nationalism. So one way of thinking about Christian nationalism is a vision for the future. Another way of thinking about it is this understanding of the past, those two things being, of course, connected. And the deep story runs something like this. The United States was founded as a Christian nation. The American founders were Orthodox Christians. The founding documents are based on Christian principles, perhaps even divinely inspired. The United States has been entrusted with a particular mission to spread democracy or capitalism or civilization or something. And in order to carry out that mission, it's been blessed with unique levels of power and prosperity. But the missions and the blessings are endangered by the increasing presence of non-whites, non-Christians, non-native born people on American soil. And that story is deep in a number of different ways. It is psychologically deep. I think that it is, for many Americans raised in a particular kind of Christian milieu, it's simply the water that they swim in and the air that they breathe. That's sort of or if you prefer a different metaphor, a kind of set of lenses through which they see and perceive the world without necessarily being able to articulate it, though of course there are some for whom it really is a kind of a self-conscious worldview. It's also deep in the sense that it has deeply permeated not only America's religious culture, but also its secular culture. I mean, you see shades of this certainly in many genres of popular movies and literature and television shows. I think that'll become clearer in just a moment. But it's also very deep historically. So if I were titling or retitling our session, I think I would retitle it The Return of Christian Nationalism as opposed to the Rise of Christian Nationalism. One of the arguments that we try to make in this book is that white Christian nationalism actually antedates the foundation of the United States. In fact, we trace it back to, all the way back to the late 17th century. So let me elaborate just a little bit on where that deep story comes from and why we trace it back so far in time. The deep story of white Christian nationalism is really, in a way, a kind of interweaving of three different threads from the Jewish and Christian scriptures, pulled in a particular way and woven together. And we call these three stories the Promised Land story, the end time story, and the racial curse story. The Promised Land story is the idea that the New World was set aside as a promised land for European Christians, from which it follows that the native peoples there were somehow unjustly occupying that land and had to be driven off the land or exterminated. That's the Promised Land story. The end time story is some version of apocalypticism, most typically what we would nowadays call premillennialism. The idea that history will culminate in a kind of a cosmic battle between the forces of good and evil, natural and supernatural, physical and spiritual, and that, of course, the United States or the English colonists will be on the side of good, and that their enemies are obviously on the side of evil. The racial curse story is the kind of classic justification for chattel slavery in the United States, that Africans are the offspring of Ham, who was cursed by Noah, that their blackness is the mark that was placed on their bodies by God, and that they have been condemned to eternal servitude and bondage. An idea that still sort of echoes through, I think, even in contemporary ideas about the so-called culture of poverty. So those are the various elements of the deep story. At this point, another objection that one often hears is, well, all right, I understand this is Christian nationalism, but in what sense is this white? I concede that this was certainly true in the antebellum United States or in the colonial era, but in what sense is this still true today? Well, here we return to our statistical analysis, and we're able to show, I think quite rigorously, that Christian nationalism amongst whites is associated with anti-black animus, with anti-immigration sentiment, with white grievance in various forms. And interestingly and importantly, although there are many African Americans who score relatively high on this white Christian nationalism scale that we've developed, it has absolutely no effect on their sense of racial grievance, and is associated with a very different set of political commitments, which are sort of closer, in shorthand, to a kind of MLK understanding of civil religion of the United States as a kind of nation of nations, people of peoples, a multiracial democracy. So that's the sense in which Christian nationalism in its contemporary instantiation is white is bound up with whiteness. At this point, some people will object, well, isn't what you're talking about really just a Christian form of patriotism? Aren't you just slandering people who love God and country? There's, of course, meters and meters of books in any good research library debating the relative meanings of patriotism and nationalism. But I would here at least want to draw a distinction between a kind of patriotism, which is at root a kind of ethnocultural nationalism, which is about people like me, our tribe, on the one hand, and a kind of patriotism, which is a devotion to institutions and ideals. And it's quite clear to me that white Christian nationalism is of this ethnocultural variety, whereas, for example, the kind of African-American version of civil religion is much more about institutions and ideals. And I, for one, would define love of country in terms of ideas and institutions rather than a particular ethnoculture. Some folks will then say, well, isn't this really kind of a fringe phenomenon? Like, I don't know anybody like this at my church. One thing I'll say is, well, maybe you don't know people at your church as well as you think you do. Because when we, again, have done empirical research on this, and there's also been research done recently by Robbie George of the Public Religion Research Institute in cooperation with the Brookings Institute, finds that somewhere around 2/3 of white evangelicals affirm to a considerable degree these kind of core tenets of Christian nationalism. This is not a fringe phenomenon, and I think here it's also very important to draw a line between evangelicalism and Christian nationalism. I mean, it's very clear that not all evangelicals are Christian nationalists. You know, I see plenty of evangelicals in this room who would never accept many of these core tenets. And it's equally important to emphasize that ideas of Christian nationalism extend outside of to non-evangelical Protestants, to Catholics, even to people of other faiths and to people of no faith. This is one of the really striking findings of some of this recent research. So it's definitely not fringe. Probably somewhere around a third of the American population affirms Christian nationalism to some degree. So where is it headed, and how worried should we be? I think the simple answer to that question is that it is headed in an increasingly anti-democratic direction, and in some cases even towards an acceptance of political violence. And here I want to raise one topic which we don't cover adequately in the book. I think there has been over the last decade a kind of a passing of the baton, if you will, the white Christian nationalist baton from sort of evangelical leadership to Pentecostal leadership, in particular to a kind of radical fringe of the Pentecostal movement known as the New Apostolic Reformation. And many of the leading figures of this movement will, I think, be familiar, at least to people in this room. The kind of person who's typically regarded as the founding father is Peter Wagner, the late Peter Wagner of Fuller Theological Seminary, but also a group of Pentecostal leaders who've been around Trump, not just Paula White, but Lance Wallnau, Doug Sheets, Che Ahn, and a variety of others. So this is not the first time this has happened. If you were to turn the clock back 100 years, the folks who were carrying the baton of white Christian nationalism in the early 20th century were not evangelicals. I mean, they were mainstream liberal Protestants. This is really not until after World War II that you see this sort of shift in leadership. And so this is not the first time this has happened. What's worrisome about this shift is, I think, it has to do with the theology and the organization of the New Apostolic Reformation. And here I would point in particular to a couple of key tenets of the New Apostolic Reformation. One is the idea of spiritual warfare, which is absolutely central. A lot of folks focus on the January 6th insurrection. I think fewer paid attention to the Jericho March that occurred on January 5th, the day before, where people were marching around the Capitol, blowing shofars, singing hymns, engaging in various kinds of testimony with the aim of liberating the Capitol from the sort of evil powers, demonic forces, which they believed had taken possession of it. The reason that this is worrisome is that it really imagines this sort of final cosmic battle between good and evil as something that's omnipresent, that's going on around us all of the time, and in which the line between good and evil does not run through people, as Augustinian Christianity would teach us, but runs between people, so that there are literally people and places who are controlled by Satan and by other demonic forces, with whom, of course, there can be absolutely no compromise whatsoever. The second key tenet is kingdom now, or dominion theology. Again, I think quite familiar to many folks in this audience, but shorthand way of putting this would simply be to say that it sort of blends elements of premillennialism and postmillennialism, so that by seizing control of the commanding heights, or in their favorite metaphor, the 7 mountains of social influence, one can literally force the end. One can literally bring about the eschaton. And so the combination of these two things is clearly a kind of ideology which is very at odds, or a political theology which is deeply at odds with any kind of liberal democratic values or norms. The organization, I think, is also worth noting. It is very decentralized, if we would say sort of acephalous form of organization. It's really an oligarchic form of organization. It's run by a sort of a core group of self-appointed apostles who recruit new people by means of co-optation, by recognizing other people as apostles. Very different in this regard from, say, the National Association of Evangelicals or the World Council of Churches, which were sort of classical, hierarchical, corporate-style organization. And I would simply point out that, that this kind of cellular acephalous organization is characteristic of revolutionary, and I would even add terrorist organization throughout the world and throughout history. This is a very flexible, resilient form of organization. So, final question that people always ask is, well, okay, you have my attention. This is scary. What can we do about this? I think that one of the main answers I typically give is that for the moment, we need to construct a popular front in defense of liberal democracy. And put a little bit more concretely, I'm talking about an alliance that reaches from Liz Cheney to AOC. So people who have very deep disagreements about many policy matters, but are united in defending American institutions and the project of American democracy, and who are able and willing to set aside some of their policy disagreements for the moment, recognizing the kind of grave grave threat that's posed right now to American democracy. I think the other thing I often say, and I think Jamar will have more to say about this than I possibly could, which is that, you know, it's very important to engage folks, you know, who have been sort of pulled into the vortex of Christian nationalism. Many of these are, you know, they're very good-hearted folks, but they're not going to listen to, you know, talking head ranting on MSNBC. For that matter, they're probably not going to listen to a Yale sociology professor. The person who they might listen to is their pastor or somebody who's sitting next to them in the pews. And that's difficult work, but I think also very, very, very necessary work. Thanks.
Thank you. Great. Thank you. Jamar.
All right. I want to start with a story I very seldom have told. That's like red meat for journalists, right? Take you back to January 2021. I lived in the Delta region of Arkansas. I was the pastor of a very small, predominantly white, non-denominational evangelical church. There was a congregational meeting, one that I didn't call, one that wasn't on the regular schedule of meetings. It was a meeting demanded by a group of our church members. And try as I might to see what they wanted to talk about ahead of time, they were very cryptic. And the only thing they said is, it can't wait. So we get to this meeting. It's a very small group, maybe 10, 12 of us. And there was a contingent of members that had some complaints, pretty common in a church. But the nature of the complaints was quite interesting. At hand were two main issues that are sort of white Christian nationalist talking points. The first was about masks and masking up at church. One of the people who had demanded this meeting was incensed that as we gathered in person each Sunday, we insisted on wearing a mask. And it became an issue of personal freedom. And she said, you know, you can wear a mask, but I shouldn't be forced to. And we're like, that's not how viruses work, but okay, I hear you. What was fascinating about her stance is that her husband was a physician. That kind of knowledge should be, pretty common in the household. The other complaint was around politics. So in the lead up to the 2020 election, I, like many preachers and pastors, talked about politics. I was very, very careful not to say, vote for this person or that person. Very, very careful not to say, this is a Christian party, this is not a Christian party. What I emphasized was truth, ethics, love of neighbor. But this person in the congregation said, every time I preached about politics, she felt attacked for being a Trump supporter and a Republican. Well, the meeting went on and on. Thankfully, other church members, they sort of came to my defense and said they appreciated my leadership and teaching and everything like that. But within a couple of weeks, that entire contingent that had demanded this congregational meeting stopped coming to church. What was devastating about it is not only the loss of that fellowship, but those were also our largest families and the ones with the most money. So about a year later, the remnant of us decided to dissolve the congregation and find other faith communities. I open with that because this is the real world impact of white Christian nationalism. Beyond the academic study of a concept or an ideology, this is affecting people and communities and relationships at a deep level. Understand that these folks had been together for decades. They started the church together. They had prayed together, sang together, worshiped together. They'd been to baptisms and weddings and funerals together. And now, because of issues like whether to wear a mask or how you talk about politics, those relationships were rent asunder. So a couple of key ideas in my time today. One is that to understand white Christian nationalism, we have to look at the localized grassroots stories on the ground in Christian churches, parachurches, and denominations. The local grassroots stories. And secondly, I want to make sure that we all understand that white Christian nationalism is integrally wrapped up in issues of racism and white supremacy. So sometimes I say Christian nationalism because it's fewer syllables, but white Christian nationalism, to me, keeping all those three terms together and the relationship to each other is very important. As I often say, white Christian nationalism is the greatest threat to democracy and the witness of the church in the United States today. White Christian nationalism is the greatest threat to democracy and the witness of the church in the United States today. Now, to prove it, I just want to take you through a couple of points. I want to talk about what I see as a sifting happening in the church in the United States today. I want to talk about what is perhaps the biggest church split in U.S. history. I want to talk about how white Christian nationalism affects other institutions beyond the church, other Christian institutions mainly. And then briefly, what may be coming next or ways forward. Now, I'm an academic. All we do is put caveats and explanations in there. So number one, I'm focusing on the Christian church, but we should all understand that white Christian nationalism has impacts far beyond the church, right? So this impacts views on immigration, on gender and sexuality, on any number of issues, and it certainly affects non-Christians and non-religious folks as well, right? The other thing I'm going to look at as we talk about race is the specific impact between black and white racial dynamics, because that's my field, but we understand that the racial component of white Christian nationalism places whiteness, or those deemed white, on top of a hierarchy that affects all other people of any other race and ethnicity. So we on the same page with that? So just because I can't spend time on it don't mean it ain't important. Now let's dive into it. I talked about a sifting in the U.S. church. You might call it a realignment. You might call it, in spiritual terms, a pruning of the church. I think it's brought on by several factors. One was COVID, because we couldn't make Sunday morning the center of our faith anymore, because we couldn't meet for a long time. And so that changed the dynamic, and it was actually a reason and a cause for a lot of people to rethink what they understood as church and where they wanted to find themselves in terms of a church community. In addition, the Me Too, Church Too movement. So looking specifically at issues of sexual abuse in churches, how many prominent leaders and men in power got away with abuses, that caused a dramatic reshuffling. We can think of, the Beth Moores of the world and her impact of leaving the Southern Baptist Convention, partly due to that. Also, gender and sexuality issues have become a major dividing line and point of contention within a lot of Christian denominations and churches. But I want to focus on one other reason for this shifting or this realignment in churches, which is racial justice. Things like Black Lives Matter. So in 2018, the New York Times published an article called A Quiet Exodus: Why Black Worshipers Are Leaving White Evangelical Churches. And it chronicled the plight of Black Christians who, for whatever reason, found themselves in majority white Christian spaces. But because of everything that was happening, I would argue from 2008 in the election of Barack Obama, to the Tea Party, to the murder of Trayvon Martin, to the killing of Mike Brown in 2014, to the rise of Black Lives Matter as a banner for the new civil rights movement, all of that, combined with Trump, caused Black Christians in particular to say, wait a minute. Do I really belong here? Do I really need to stay here? After all I've sacrificed and put up with, is it reciprocal? And a lot of folks said no, so they quietly left. In Black church circles, you got to put up the finger. They just left, walked out the side door. But then these things kept happening. We kept hearing the racism. We kept seeing the callousness. And the organization that I'm a part of, the Witness, a Black Christian collective, and our podcast, Pass the Mic, we initiated in 2021 a campaign called Leave Loud. The time for a quiet exodus is over. We got to leave loud. And the reason was we wanted to be witnesses to the ways we were treated in these predominantly white Christian institutions. Because what happens is if you leave quietly, number one, you give those institutions an opportunity to continue their bad behavior. There's no accountability. And number two, if you leave quietly, you send a tacit message to other Black people and people of color that this environment is okay, because you haven't voiced the ways it's been toxic. So when we leave loud, it's not to bash the church or Christians or anything like that. It's to make sure they're held accountable for the ways they've harmed and even traumatized Black people and people of color in their midst. And it's also to signal to other folks who are concerned about racial justice, hey, they're not ready yet. They got some work to do. So just be aware. Make your own choice, but just be aware. And so in that series, this podcast series on Pass the Mic, we collected stories about Black people who were willing to go on mic and tell their story of racial injury, of racial trauma. There's an interesting statistic. Pew Research did this very in-depth study. And it said the percentage of Black attendees at multiracial churches declined from 27% in 2012 to 21% in 2019. reason I bring that up is there's this whole big multiracial, multi-ethnic church movement. And the actual percentage of multiracial churches tripled from the late 90s to the early 2010s, from 6% to 19%. But then we see this data that from 2012 to 2019, there's actually been a decline in the participation of Black people in multiracial churches. Now, to me, that indicates that multiracial churches may not be the answer to racial inequality that people once thought. Because when you look at it, almost all of the movement toward multiracial churches has been Black people going into predominantly or historically white spaces. It's not the opposite. White people going to other churches with more people of color. And so the level of sacrifice and the level of harm has not, just isn't worth it to a lot more people. I also want to mention briefly that this shuffling and realignment, it's not a fringe movement. So there are the extremes for sure. In the recent PRRI Brookings report called A Christian Nation, ? Understanding the Threat of Christian Nationalism to American Democracy and Culture, reports that nearly 2/3 of white evangelical Protestants qualify as either Christian national adherents, 29%, or sympathizers, 35%. So 29% adherents, bold, out front, out loud, championing white Christian nationalism. But another 35% who are sympathizers. The sympathizers are the group we got to worry about. Because while they may not be as extreme and as full-throated in their support of white Christian nationalism, they don't prevent it. They are what I would characterize in my book, The Color of Compromise. They're the people who compromise. Or they're the people who are complicit. All right, Martin Luther King Jr. said it better than I could say it. He said, I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess over the past few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I think those words, moderate and sympathizer, are almost interchangeable. King said, I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, in other words, the extremes, but the white moderate who's more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace. Let's not talk about that stuff. Let's just all get along and be unified, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. So even though the extremes may be a smaller number, when you count those sympathizers, we got a real big problem. A real big problem. Now, let me talk briefly, because I'm a historian by trade. I got my MDiv, so I do the theology thing, but my real gear is history. So I got to touch on that and touch on what I think might be the biggest church split in U.S. history, which is the split between the Black church and the white church. You know that phrase, 11 o'clock a.m. is the most segregated hour in America? There's reasons for that. And history has the receipts. I mean, you can go all the way back. 1452, the papal bull by Pope Nicholas V, so-called the doctrine of discovery, that basically said to Europeans, if you find any land where there's not Christians, then you can conquer it in the name of Christ and then convert the people. But make sure you get the gold and the silver and the natural resources first. This is the beginnings of what becomes the concept of race. You got to understand, especially in the U.S. context, race and religion are mutually constitutive. Race and religion are mutually constitutive. In the colonial era, European was coded as Christian. And Native American and African were coded as pagan, which puts you on a lower tier, not only spiritually, but socially and economically as well. Because then you begin to develop justifications for the labor exploitation, which becomes race-based chattel slavery, But it began with this theory that if you're not Christian, you're exploitable. But then you move on. Of course, you can look at, here's the thing. As analysts, as journalists, what's happening in faith communities is a bellwether for what's going to happen politically. So the Methodists and the Baptists and the Presbyterians split on the question of slavery before the Civil War. So you could see it coming in churches, in denominations. And it boggles the mind. We say Baptists split over slavery. That ain't specific enough, y'all. See, that's why we got to study history. We think we know, but we have no idea. So they split over slavery, but it was the specific question of whether one could be a missionary and a slaveholder at the same time. Think about that. Most of the time, missionaries were going to nations where the people were black and brown. They were giving up everything, fulfilling the Great Commission, and going to preach the gospel to the nations, while at home, they enslaved the very people they wanted to preach the gospel to abroad. The same thing's happening today. What's going on in local churches, congregations, denominations, fellowships, all of that is giving us a clue about what's coming down the road politically. I'm a historian. I look backward, not forward, but I think there's some evidence there, right? Also, this quote is just golden. This is very interesting. In 1922, so you know there were 3 iterations of the Ku Klux Klan, right? It wasn't just, the first one was right after the Civil War. Of course, we all know the one during the Civil Rights Movement, but the most virulent and widespread was during the Jim Crow era. That was revivified, resurgent in 1915. And then several years later, in 1922, the guy who led this resurgence of the Klan, his name was William Simmons, he wrote this in an interview. He said, "The Ku Klux Klan admits membership to none but native-born, white, Gentile, Protestant Americans, whose statement of principles was a restoration of the fundamental principles of American democracy as embodied in the Constitution of the United States, an organization whose code of conduct was Christianity. Native-born, white, Gentile, Protestant Americans." First of all, you hear the racial language in there. You hear the xenophobic language in there. You see the Christian language in there. And then it talks about the Constitution of the United States, this very originalist view of this document, whose code of conduct was Christianity. The United States was founded as a Christian nation. So says the founder of the resurgent Ku Klux Klan. Now I can go through all kinds of things. The last thing I want to do is set up for you the contrast between white Christian nationalism and the black Christian tradition. So ultimately, these result in very different approaches to faith and politics. Black Christians put their faith into politics, for sure, but to very different ends. All the way back in the late 1700s, black people were bringing what they called freedom suits to state legislatures, and they were using the words of the Declaration of Independence to argue their case. Oh, we're all created equal, endowed by our Creator with rights and dignity. Okay, well, so what about us? That applies to us, right? You can't enslave us. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. What about us? Black folks saw that. You can fast forward and look at the ways that black Christians described white Christianity in America. David Walker's Appeal, 1829. How can preachers and people of America believe the Bible? Does it teach them any distinction on account of a man's color? 1829. Frederick Douglass, you remember that passage. It's in the appendix of his first autobiography. He says, "Between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I see the widest possible difference. I love the pure, peaceable, impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slaveholding, women whipping, cradle plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. We saw the difference. We talk about what to do about white Christian nationalism. How about we learn from the oldest and largest organization, institution dedicated to resisting racism and uplifting Black people and civil rights, the Black church tradition. See, what we miss in this white Christian nationalist conversation a lot of times is that it's not the only expression of US Christianity. It's certainly not the only expression of global Christianity. We want to reinvent the wheel, try to find new ways, new tactics. Actually, there have been people and institutions engaged in this struggle for a long time. White Christian nationalism is simply the latest label we've given it. Black folk just call it surviving. Your faces right now are awesome. I don't know what is going through your brains. Everybody okay? We almost through it, y'all. We almost through it. Listen, I got to tell you this story. All right. So we've been talking about churches. It's not just churches. It affects like any Christian institution. So I was just made aware a couple of weeks ago, somebody tagged me in an Instagram post. I've never met this person before. His name is Samuel Jokel, and he is a professor at Palm Beach Atlantic University. He tagged me in the post because he'd heard about Leave Loud. I'd also done a podcast series called White Nation Under God. Y'all, if you're running out of story ideas, follow jamartisby.substack.com. Ooh, my goodness. And my personal podcast Footnotes. So that's where I did this White Nation Under God series about white Christian nationalism. I interviewed all these experts, blah, blah, blah. So because of that, he reached out to me, tagged me in this post. What had happened was he was teaching class one day, and then he comes out of class, and the dean of his school and the provost are waiting for him in the hallway. And they said, Professor Jokel, your contract renewal is on pause until we review your syllabus and your unit on racial justice. A single parent had called the school, got a hold of the president, and he came under review. Mind you, Professor Jokel has been teaching this unit for 12 years, and he's been at the school for over 20. So, to his credit, I think he was being courageous, and he went public with his treatment. So as soon as this happened, he did this Instagram post, tagged me. Well, they got real mad about that. They were mad about the racial justice. They got real mad about him going public. Long story short, about a week and a half later, he walks into his office. His computer's gone. His keyboard's gone. All of his files and everything are gone. He didn't know what had happened. He got no word. He thought at first he'd been burglarized. Sends an email to his dean that day, says, hey, all my stuff's gone. What's up? Please advise. Doesn't get an answer. Gets an answer the next day through his lawyers. Everybody had lawyered up by this time. Not only was his contract not going to be renewed for the following year, he was to cease and desist teaching immediately. Not even allowed back on campus. The most heartbreaking part for me as an educator, he did not get a chance to say goodbye to his students. He was gone. Only time he can come back is for a 4-hour period with the head of security next to him to get his stuff. So my point being, this is about this anti-CRT, anti-woke crusade that's affecting churches, but also other Christian institutions. I said in the beginning, white Christian nationalism is the greatest threat to democracy and the witness of the church in the United States today. And to understand it, we have to look at these local grassroots stories. What's happening in churches, denominations, parachurches, nonprofits. And that white Christian nationalism is integrally wrapped up in racism and white supremacy. And to you, my analysts and journalist friends, we must be students of religion just as we're students of politics. And I don't think it's overstating it to say that the future of our democracy and our spiritual life may depend on it. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, friends, over to you. We're going to go for a half hour and then take a short break for coffee and then come back. So if you've got a question, flag in. And Karen Tumulty is up first. You can use your table tent to get attention, or I'll just try to keep a list up here. Karen Tumulty from Washington Post.
First of all, thank you so much. This has been fascinating and enlightening. But I wanted to ask about sort of the foreign policy aspect of white Christian nationalism. The degree to which, for instance, there is so much support in parts of the evangelical community for Putin. You look, when Ronald Reagan first used the phrase evil empire, it was in front of an evangelical audience. And now you have, as Putin's launching the invasion of Ukraine, you have people like Franklin Graham saying, pray for Putin. What is it just that they see people like Putin as defenders of traditional marriage? I mean, or is there something else going on where they seem to be so enamored with authoritarianism?
A couple things. First, I think there's a sort of an Epcot Center version of what Russia looks like that animates this. So they imagine it as a racially and religiously homogeneous society that is hierarchically ordered, that defends its borders, that is proud of its civilization. Again, this is, as I said, an Epcot Center version of the reality in Russia. I think another aspect of it that does need to be underlined is the very real transnational connections between certain leaders and organizations of American Christianity and the Russian Orthodox Church, with its extremely tight links to the Putin regime. This is something which has been quite systematically managed and pursued by Putin and his inner circle, cultivating these connections as part of his foreign policy. So I think that's really quite key. But the last thing to say is, just in keeping with the theme about the threat to democracy, that there is kind of an increasing enamoration, I think, in some circles with authoritarian styles of leadership. This is partly a sense of grievous and threat. It's partly the effect of the Trump years, the sense that we're living in a political emergency that requires strongman leadership, and clearly, Putin has cast himself very much in that role. So it is certainly to folks who lived through the Cold War, it is whiplash inducing to see this, but I think it is something that has to be taken quite seriously, as a foreign policy matter. Yeah.
I try to jump around, so maybe Miranda Kennedy at NPR.
Thank you both for that. Jamar, you said that we should look to the Black church. So can you talk a little bit about what the Black church is doing about white nationalism?
So it's interesting because that nomenclature is not super common with Black Christians or Black pastors. We simply know it as racism. So if you look for that heading in Black churches, you may not find it. What I think is both difficult and rich about looking to the Black church tradition is that it's not some sort of specific initiative or movement. It infuses the life of Black churches, which are incredibly dynamic and diverse. So I'm using that just for utility's sake here, that term, the Black church. But what you'll find is the priorities are different. So it's not controversial to talk about political engagement, voting rights. It's not even a topic of conversation that critical race theory is taking over or whatever. In fact, there's vociferous resistance to those kinds of things. So I think one of the main values of studying Black Christians is the way we frame the conversation. White Christian nationalism begins with a particular kind of framing, which Phil very helpfully points out as a deep story of the United States. So in theological terms, like white Christians love to start with the resurrection in the New Testament and Paul's epistles. Black Christians start with the Exodus and the literal liberation of enslaved people. So it's a bottom-up perspective as opposed to a top-down or empowered perspective. Now this infuses sermons, topics for Sunday school and Bible school, and ways of viewing political life. One of the clearest examples that I can think of, I lived in Arkansas for 15 years up to the past 2 months, and I was keenly engaged in the gubernatorial race between Sarah Huckabee Sanders and Chris Jones. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, daughter of a pastor, truly Southern Baptist. Both of them ran what I call very faith-forward campaigns. Chris Jones also, son of ministers. He himself is a minister. And their political visions couldn't be more different. And this is just one sort of political illustration of the difference between Black church tradition versus white Christian nationalism.
Okay, we've got Tim Dalrymple, Molly Ball, Will Salatin, and Dahlia. I'll go ahead. Tim, from Christianity Today.
Yeah, 2 questions.
And Tim, if you wouldn't mind, hit that mic.
Can you hear it? Okay. Yeah, 2 questions. So it sounded from your talk in particular, Philip, that the influence of white Christian nationalism has been waxing and waning since, I think you said, the late 1600s. And so I'm just curious what we can learn from those waning periods. Are there any things that you see when it's kind of on the downturn that might give us some guidance? What historically have people done that may have led to either a diminishment of scale or a diminishment of influence in white Christian nationalist movements? Then the second question, I found it really fascinating. You were talking about the New Apostolic Reformation. We were watching in the lead up to the 2020 election all of these prophecies, and you could find them all over YouTube, people who were sharing prophecies about the outcome of the election and what would follow immediately after, or after the election had happened, what was going to happen on January 6th, and et cetera. And it was an interesting admixture of kind of a premillennial apocalyptic vision and QAnon. And so I was curious how you see the rise of conspiracism and QAnon alongside the rise of white Christian nationalism, particularly in Pentecostal contexts.
Great questions. Let me take the second one first. Simply by saying that there is tremendous overlap between the QAnon community and certain kinds of end times oriented Christianity, I think in particular, certain kinds of Pentecostalism. And there is, I think, also a certain sort of natural fit between QAnon conspiracy theorizing and, again, a certain kind of pre-millennialism, in the sense that, both imagine a kind of a set of half invisible, shadowy, dark figures, a cabal, quite literally, operating, a satanic cabal operating behind the scenes. And this, I think, also has a sort of a deep psychological appeal. I mean, particularly for people who feel aggrieved or wronged or marginalized in one way or another, by elites, by experts, in the sense that you possess some kind of gnosis, literally some kind of secret knowledge that sort of a skeleton key, as it were, that allows you to see things that nobody else can see. I think one of the peculiar things about this QAnon is it's not so much that it is drawn in some folks with strong end times beliefs, but that it is also connected them from what I forget who coined this phrase, connected up to the Yoga Mom to QAnon pipeline, so that there is sort of an increasing overlap between this kind of wellness, spirituality, New Agey community. I mean, it's definitely made some very strange bedfellows. In terms of the ebbing and flowing of white Christian nationalism, I think I have a better sense of the flow than the ebb. So I think if you really look over the long span of American history, I would point to 4 factors that tend to lead to periods of flow, and those are mass immigration, foreign wars against ethnocultural others, economic crisis and social inequality, and movements of Black empowerment, in no particular order. And just run through that checklist very quickly in your mind over the last 20 years. We are, I believe, today, or was it yesterday, celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Second Iraq War. 2008, longest period of sustained mass migration since the early 20th century, and of course, Black Lives Matter and the new civil rights movement. So, in that sense, we should not be the least bit surprised about the flow. But I really have much less of a sense of the ebb. Are these simply things that play themselves out? Do radical movements sometimes simply burn out and end in exhaustion? I think all that I can say really, in retrospect, is that there really have been a series of moments in the history of American democracy and the history of American Christianity where there were 2 quite distinct paths, where there was a fork in the road, and there were always some people pointing down the road towards multiracial democracy, and there were always some people who wanted to double down on Christian nationalism. And the hope would be that we've reached a moment in our history where the number of folks who are pointing down the road towards multiracial democracy is larger. And again, I think echoing Jamar, that some of the people who've signposted that have been part of the Black church tradition. But I think it is also important to emphasize that there have always been white allies as well in that movement. I mean, whether you're talking about Roger Williams, or whether you're talking about William Lloyd Garrison, or whether you're talking about Abraham Joshua Heschel, there have always been allies, Christians and non, pointing in the other direction. And so this, again, is just a way of sort of, rearticulating my argument for a popular front that has to, run across not only, lines of policy and partisanship, but also across lines of faith and no faith at this time, if it's to be successful.
Just a quick follow-up to that. Jamar used the stat of 29% of these sort of harder core, from the survey, but there's a big group of sympathizers. You guys use the stat of about 25% in the book, ambassadors, right? You and Sam. Is that contingent that is more strong on white Christian nationalism, as you see it, similar to sort of times past, like you described, or larger?
It's hard to be certain because the PRI survey uses a set of questions that were developed specifically to capture Christian nationalism, whereas the ones that we use in the book are from a survey that contains some questions which spoke to Christian nationalism. So it may simply be an artifact of the scales. That said, I think there's some reason to believe that there has been a kind of a hardening of Christian nationalism in some circles as well. So one piece of circumstantial evidence for this is there was a much cited piece of research that was done by some folks at Baylor around 2016, which found that rates of church attendance were inversely correlated with support for Trump. And that's a line that's been, I've certainly heard made, well, but people go to church a lot. I mean, aren't they kind of insulated or immunized against the appeal of this? Fortunately not. In fact, what we've, again, found in our more recent research is that that correlation is now positive. So that white Christian nationalism and church attendance is now positively correlated rather than negatively correlated, which, without digging deeper, my read of that would be that there has been a kind of a hardening of those lines, even though there has been a lot of debate within white Christian churches about this, and I know that there are a lot of folks who now explicitly disavow or resist or criticize that label as well. It's, I think, kind of a hardening of the boundaries.
Molly Ball, Time Magazine.
Is that on? There, okay. I also have two questions. First of all, Jamar, you talk about this movement, dividing communities, pitting people against each other, filling their minds with anger and hatred. That seems like a feel-bad movement. So maybe this is only answerable on the level of like human nature, but why are people drawn to this, or what are they getting out of it when it seems like such a bummer? And second of all, for a crowd of journalists, we're rather short on Jews today, so I'll ask it. How do we feel about the Jews? There was a poll that just came out showing that Jews were the most positively regarded by other religious groups, and I've certainly been around lots of evangelicals who tell me how much they love Jews in Israel, but there does seem to be a nexus with the rising tide of anti-Semitism as well.
What's the appeal of this movement if its results are so negative, kind of a thing? I think a sociologist could probably answer in depth around, this is a lot about feelings of belonging and identity. One of the reasons it's so hard to extricate people from white Christian nationalist beliefs is because they feel that they're part of a community and part of a group, even if it's not their local congregation. Gives them a sense of identity and purpose, something they can champion, even if others observing are like, but the results are trash. Like, why would you? But that feeling is very strong. I had a conversation with somebody who's writing a book. He's a former neo-Nazi, and now his mission is to talk to other white folks about the dangers of extremism. He's gotten out of that movement, but he said what was so alluring and attractive was it gave him a group of people where he felt like he was accepted and he belonged. So I think that's one of the things. I think also when you layer religion on top of ideologies like this, it means that to disagree is not simply to disagree with my idea or opinion, it's to disagree with God. So there's this really heavy theological imprimatur on white Christian nationalism that says I must adhere to that because that's what it means to be a good Christian. And if it drives a dividing line between people I was once close to, well, that's just what happens with the gospel. That's just the truth is a sword. It'll divide, right? So I think that's part of how folks look at that.
I thought that was a great answer. I would just add one more thing to what Jamar said, which is I think that the deep story of white Christian nationalism confers a sort of birthright citizenship on all white Christians, so that you feel like the country was founded by my people, even if your people in the specific sense didn't arrive here until 100 years ago or 150 years ago, and therefore also a sense that this is your country, this country has always belonged to you, and that even for, say, a generational African American whose ancestors were here hundreds of years before yours, somehow has less of a title to the country than you do. I also want to speak to the question of anti-Semitism that you raised, Molly, because it is one that I've wrestled with and struggled to figure out as well. It is very paradoxical in some ways. I think the key to unlocking this is understanding the influence of Christian Zionism. And I'll just open this with a little anecdote that I think really illustrates how this works. There was a campaign event that Rebbe Mastriano, Doug Mastriano's wife, was at, and somebody in the audience sort of criticized her over some statements that she had made about Israel. And she responded roughly to the effect that, well, I think I might be a better Jew than you. And what on earth is going on there? So on the one hand, I mean, I think Christian Zionism, influence of Christian Zionism over the last 30, 40 years has led to a kind of a general but very abstract softening of attitudes of white Christians towards Jews. But again, Jews in a very sort of abstract sense. But at the same time, a certain understanding of Jews as people whose country is actually Israel, and their status as a good Jew is completely dependent on their relationship to Israel. So that, in fact, an American Jew who considers themselves an American first of all, and who voices criticism of Israel can actually be understood as anti-Semitic or as a bad Jew, whereas somebody like Rebbe Mastriano, who is extremely pro-Israel, whatever that means to her, is in some strange sense a better Jew than somebody who's an American Jew.
Will Salatin, the Bulwark.
Thank you both. I wanted to ask about the relationship between white nationalism and Christian nationalism as it's playing out today. Jamar, I know you said they were mutually constitutive, so I wanted to ask about a little bit of a tension there. I feel like what I'm seeing today politically is, at least at the level of, not say Tucker Carlson, who's still doing great replacement stuff, but at the level of like Republican Party committees, even to the point of some Trump rallies, is an attempt by the Republican Party to broaden its image, at least, but to broaden it at a fairly fundamental level, like emphasizing how many more black candidates they're running for Congress. I believe they had a record this year. Also Latino candidates, women, just emphasizing diversity, which even if it's for show, they seem to be responding to some current in society. So I'm curious what you make of that. And in particular, it's sort of related to that, I've been sort of forming in my head the idea, the impression from what I'm seeing, that again, I'll just speak about the Republican Party for a minute, is trying to change the lines, who's inside or who's out the circle of nationalism. So for example, still there's a replacement coming, but the replacement is more like Muslims or new immigrants from Latin America, whereas black Americans who have been here for generations or Latinos who have been here for generations are being portrayed as inside the circle, and the stories of, I see at the same time as criticism of critical race theory or whatever term they come up with, I see strangely at the same time more acknowledgement of the history of slavery, of racial injustice in this country. So I wonder if there is a change going on in the nature of the nationalism, even as the idea of it's our nation and not somebody else's is being maintained.
So to call it white Christian nationalism isn't to say that black people and other people of color don't participate. There's always been complicity on the part of the oppressed with the oppressor, historically. I think one of the questions we should ask are what are the requirements for admission? So even as boundary lines are being drawn and redrawn, what are the requirements of people to be so-called included in these boundaries? And what I think you'll find is with the people of color who are complicit in white Christian nationalism, the price of admission is almost complete agreement. It's not as if they're being included in these circles for the differences they bring. It's baldly a very utilitarian measure to put to blunt the charges of racism. Oh, we've got Herschel Walker. Clearly, we're not racist, right? But that ideologically, they're completely in line. So how are they actually changing the movement is one of the things that I would say. The other thing is, I think part of it is language, right? Like, so white Christian nationalists use a lot of religious language that Black Christians in particular use as well. The language of faith and God and freedom and all of these things have resonance, but actually have very different meanings. But if you're not attuned to that, you might be sort of taken in by some of this. I also think some of it's generational. We did a podcast episode of what do we do with our Black parents? Folks getting sucked in. We haven't talked about technology's role in all this. Getting sucked in by a YouTube algorithm. You click on one thing and then more and more and more and more and more. And before you know it, you're down a road that leads to some very, very unhelpful beliefs and actions. And they never intended to do it, but they were sort of sucked in. So those are a couple thoughts on that.
So I would just start with a very general observation that many people who study race, I think, would agree with, which is that the racial order in the United States is very much in flux. At the moment, it might shift towards a racial order that's Black, brown, and white. It might reharden around a Black-white divide with an expanded understanding of whiteness that would include Latinos, for example, and in some sense Asians as well. That's a very general observation that intersects with this. I think that you're quite right, though, that one possible outcome of this in terms of Christian nationalism is that white Christian nationalism becomes, to some degree, a nativist Christian nationalism, which is redefined around native birth. And I certainly think that there are some folks who are strategizing in that way. So I think that's another possibility. I do want to say one other thing, though, about the relationship between white nationalism and Christian nationalism. I think that we have to understand that historically white nationalism, the KKK was, as Jamar rightly pointed out, it was not just an anti-Black organization. It was an anti-Jewish organization, it was a nativist organization, it was an anti-Catholic organization. So, I mean, there's always been a connection between white nationalism and Christian nationalism in the United States. So I think, if one looks at the sort of Reagan-Bush era, there was a very clear distancing. Keeping those folks outside of the coalition. I mean, if I'm remembering correctly, George H.W. Bush went down to Louisiana to campaign against David Duke whenever he was running for Senate, I think, or governor. I forget one of his campaign runs. I'm trying to imagine that happening now. I don't think so. And of course, this is partly, that the sort of MAGA side of the Republican coalition trying to, expand its reach and doubling down on its strategy of mobilizing white grievance. But of course, it takes two to tango, and this is also the latest iteration of the historic white nationalist strategy of trying to mainstream their ideas by cloaking themselves in a kind of more respectable version of conservatism. And this, one of the ways in which this is being done is by people who are avowedly racist, white supremacists. No, it's not really about race, it's about civilization. We're trying to defend the Judeo-Christian tradition, and we're trying to defend Western civilization. And of course, that sounds all much more respectable than saying we're worried about white genocide and we're trying to defend the white race. But again, that's a tried and true and very old strategy on the radical right in the United States.
May I suggest that we take a break? We'll regroup in about 15 minutes or so with Dahlia, I'll go ahead first, and then Elena, and then Matt Lewis, and a couple of others, okay? So 15-minute break, restrooms downstairs, enjoy the air, and we'll regroup at like 10:50. All right, well, how about diving in? First question up, if this works, is from Dahlia. Go ahead.
Thank you. I had two separate questions. One is I was interested in the statistic that was shared about the percentage of Black people who go to multiracial churches and how it's gone down, and whether the difference was people leaving the church altogether or joining Black churches. So I'm interested in that trend. And then the second thing is I'd love to hear the thoughts of both speakers on the dimension of white Christian nationalism that hasn't been specifically named, but I think has been implied, which is Islamophobia, very, very strong anti-Muslim animus. And this strange emergence of almost like an alliance between some Muslims and some white Christian nationalists in opposition to what they both term sort of like the woke mob. So like in Dearborn, there were city council meetings where Arab Muslims and basically what I would deem as white Christian nationalists very strongly opposing curriculum changes in the schools and certain books that they felt were inappropriate for their children. Do you see almost an exploitation of Muslims' fears around a threat to their conservative social values being used where this group that hates them, wants them gone, is like using them as a convenient ally when it comes to this? Do you see a strange alliance emerging because of some of these issues around gender and sexuality, especially when it comes to schools?
So to the first question about Black attendance at multiracial congregations and where are they going? So a majority of Black people overall still attend majority or historically Black churches. And this is coming from the Pew report, Faith Among Black Americans. And so, but it differs by generation. And so it's much higher among older Black people than younger Black people. Gen Z, about 29% attend a congregation that is majority Black. We are seeing higher numbers become religiously unaffiliated, but that doesn't mean they aren't religiously engaged. So among the 21% of Black Americans who say they're religiously unaffiliated, just 3% identify as either atheist or agnostic. And then the 18% say that their religion is nothing in particular, but 94% of that category that say nothing in particular still believe in God or higher power and pray regularly. So still very religious. Black Americans are the most demographically religious group still. And even when they're not in church, they're still spiritual, religious in some manner.
Yeah, the question you pose about the relationship between American Muslims and white Christian nationalists is a really fascinating one. It's one that intrigues me. I don't know that much research has been done on this, and so I can't really speak authoritatively about it. I think I can really only speculate about what's going on. Just to sort of put it in a larger frame, again, though, I would say something similar to what I said in my response to Karen Tumulty, which is that one of the paradoxical things about religious nationalist movements today, not just in the United States, is that they are increasingly transnational. It's not just to say, which of course is also the case, that there are, for example, connections between radical Pentecostals in sub-Saharan Africa and in the United States. That, of course, is also true. But there are also connections that extend across even very hard religious boundaries, such as the one between American Christians and Muslims. Certainly, I think there is an element of opportunism operating here, no doubt about that. Though you see analogous things going on, where you see different groups that have deep religious disagreements and even animosities organizing around sort of shared values of social conservatism. I think it's interesting and important that gender in schools are really the site. Former student of mine did an ethnography comparing Muslim and Christian schools, and one of his findings is that the really key dividing line within the Muslim schools was around issues of gender, whereas within the Christian schools it was around issues of evolution and science. And that the shift, I think, in sort of one of the main battle lines from the culture wars to transgenderism and gender ideology, that probably is really crucial to making this sort of an unlikely alliance possible. It's because you're quite right. It does seem utterly paradoxical given just the utter hysteria around Sharia law coming to the United States and so on and so forth, and the degree to which American Muslims had become the paradigmatic ethnocultural other for Christian nationalists after 9/11. So it is a kind of a head-spinning thing, though if I were, again, engaging in reckless forecasting, which, you shouldn't do as a social scientist, and Will is cheering me on, I think the racial stuff is going to trump this in the end. I don't see this as an enduring alliance. I see this as something that will be short-lived and opportunistic. I just can't imagine it being reconfigured in that way at this point in time. I mean, in a purely theoretical way, you can imagine a kind of nativist Abrahamic nationalism that would sort of include Muslims, like as a purely theoretical possibility, as like a practical possibility. I put the odds of that at about 0 over a 20-year time horizon.
Elena Plott, in the Atlantic.
Jamar, my question is for you. I was glad that Philip brought up the Jericho March, because my question to you as a pastor, how do you engage with those who quite sincerely root the motivation for their white nationalist politics or white nationalist sympathetic politics in their particular interpretation of the gospel? Which is to say that you're not talking with somebody about, different views in the marginal tax rate or something like that. I mean, this comes down to your understanding of what salvation means, what it means to live a Christ-like life versus what they believe. I have, in the many Trump rallies I've covered, I'll admit that I have found myself often when I engage with people there in interviews, the conversation ends with me thinking more as an evangelical Christian myself versus a journalist, because I do wonder how healing happens when, the people who are in the Jericho March are very sincere and I think mean well. And their response to you when you say, when you challenge that interpretation of the gospel is, well, Jesus said we'd be condemned for following him outwardly as we are right now. So I guess a more specific prompt would be, when the congregate comes to you and says, I feel as though you're attacking me from the pulpit because I am a Trump Republican, how do you respond to that in a manner of, grace and healing?
That's great. So 2 caveats. One, the further along I am in this racial justice work, the less I concern myself with persuading people who aren't already about racial justice. And it's not because I don't care. It's because we have work to do. Biblically, what I tell Christians is go to Mark chapter 6. Jesus sends out the 12 and says, go to every village and town, and if they won't receive you, shake the dust from their sandals, right? So move on. The other thing I'll say as a caveat, it's very difficult. This is not a one-liner or a stump speech that you can give again and again that's just going to click the light bulb on for people. It just doesn't work like that. Again, it's these issues of community and identity and belonging that you're talking about. What I have found helpful in those instances when people are resisting for whatever reasons in various ways is, number one, beginning with your personal story. So for white Christians in particular, talking to other white Christians, I say, talk about why you are now concerned with these issues. What happened? Did you read a book? Did you know someone? Did you have an experience? Why? Because, number one, stories are powerful in general. And number two, a personal testimony is very evangelical, right? I'm giving my personal testimony. And it's a little bit harder to argue with one's personal experience. You can disagree with the conclusion and everything, but it's a little bit harder to just drop the curtain and not listen at all. Second, because these are folks who really think they're adhering to the Bible, okay, well, let's talk about that. Let's go to the biblical text. And I am thoroughly convinced that as much as we talk about race in the church nowadays, we still do a terrible job, especially among white Christians, of really walking people through how to understand how the Bible applies to modern race relations. So it's not a single sermon. It's not an illustration in one talk. It has to be baked in to the very way you do religious life. That means Sunday schools and Bible studies and who's in the pulpit and who's listened to and what books are in the pastor's study and all of those kinds of things. So that being the case, let's actually look at some of the biblical texts, because supposedly this is something that we can agree on, that the Bible's important. So let's go there. And then lastly is the stuff like Phil and I do, because they're already inoculated against me. I'm woke, you know. Don't give them the color of compromise to start, because they'll say that's just propaganda. Don't give them the flag and the cross to start, because there's this sort of, we haven't talked about the sort of anti-intellectualism that's sort of part and parcel to all of this stuff. But you can get there. One book I think is really helpful along with these is Emerson and Smith's Divided by Faith. That's a really good one to sort of give a lay of the land sociologically, even though it's 20 plus years old. I think it lays a good foundation for what's happening. So I don't know that you're going to see broad movement, no matter how effective the sort of techniques we use are. But I think, for me, my energy is among the coalition of the willing, trying to form these sort of anti-authoritarianism, pro-democracy coalitions to move forward together.
Jamar, are you saying it's a question of spiritual formation? We should probably have a conversation about that.
Could have something to do with it.
That's great. All right, we've got Matt Lewis, Adam Harris, David Brooks, Mustafa Akyol, Christine Emba up. So Matt.
All right. So I go to a fundamentalist, mostly white fundamentalist church in West Virginia, and I've been going to basically evangelical churches most of my life, and there's always been a sense that we are living in the end times, but I think an increasing sense that the church is under attack and that even persecution against Christians could be coming. And although I think this kind of apocalyptic victimhood is overwrought, they have some arguments, right? They have some points. And for example, I mean, there's a sense that cancel culture is run amok. If you use the wrong pronouns, you can be canceled. There's a sense that it is the left that is obsessed with race and racial identity politics, and that they don't want a colorblind society. You have issues like, puberty blockers for trans kids that have just changed the entire political dynamic. So I think there have actually even been studies that show that the left and the Democratic Party have moved more on issues, actually public policy issues, farther to the left than the Republican Party or the conservative movement has moved to the right, again, specifically talking about public policy issues. At this point, I know it probably sounds like whataboutism. I think Christian nationalism is very bad. But I guess one question is, to what degree is this backlash understandable and predictable, and actually not an absurd response to a left that has actually become more radicalized in the last decade or two?
I'm looking at you, Jamar.
Oh, I would love for you to begin.
Throwing the ball back at me. Yeah, it's definitely complicated. Polarization, there's been polarization in both directions. Political scientists debate and argue about whether it's been symmetric or asymmetric. And those are very technical debates that I don't think we're going to be able to vet in this context. I guess, my sense is still that some of this is not really about actual persecution of Christians so much as it is about a decentering of Christianity and a loss of privilege, which feels like persecution. I think you could even a little bit, the term cancel, like if you sort of look at the history of that term, when it first, and it's a real thing. What it originally meant was somebody who really, for one stray remark, possibly made 20 years ago, is basically deprived of their life and livelihood and public stature, right? Today, it just means somebody who says something you don't like that makes you feel uncomfortable. I think if you start probing people when they talk about incidents of cancellation, that is often what they mean, is somebody who's challenging their views about race or gender in particular. That said, are there, is it the case that there are in some contexts, college campuses, for example, that there has been something of a chilling effect where students are hesitant sometimes to really engage in debate and say what they think, and where these admittedly very complicated moral and political questions would get aired? I think that is also true. My own feeling at the moment, and this again is just speculation, is that their pendulum is swinging back a little bit the other direction. I see this on college campuses now, that that some of the professoriate and the students who might have just been kind of quiet and kept their heads low are not doing that anymore. And I don't just mean the heterodox academy folks. I mean people who might have regarded that crew as too extreme. Anyway, that's not a great answer, but my best attempt.
I would just briefly add, there certainly are extremes and missteps, right, that are problematic. There's definitely an orthodoxy on the left. Y'all have experienced it, what you feel like you can and can't say in even progressive circles. So there's a point to that. I don't find it ultimately that persuasive in terms of, this is truly a case of, persecution or something, or however you want to label it. It's mildly uncomfortable, and it's the thing that quote, when you're used to privilege, equality feels like oppression. That's what I find more often. But we can't even get to the point of having this conversation because the glaring issues of racism and xenophobia and sexism and all of these things are not things that people, especially younger people, are willing to sort of compromise or meet in the middle on. And it's long past time for folks on the right to recognize like real change needs to be made. And so I think those conversations should be had. There's certainly things to discuss, but the issues that are barriers are so big, right now, and catalyzed by the political sphere. We can't even get to that table. before we deal with some other issues. This is my feeling.
I'll just say one more thing to this, which is I think, in a way, the less remarked side effect sometimes of political correctness on campus is an unwillingness to speak about social inequality, to speak about class inequality, and frankly, to recognize that incredible harm, suffering, dislocation that a lot of these rural communities have experienced over the last 40 or 50 years. That's real. A lot of my family is settled in eastern Iowa and southern Illinois, and to watch what's happened to some of those small towns of farming communities over the last half century as they've been taken over by corporate agribusiness, as tractor factories and the small diners and cafes and shops that used to be run by local people have been shut down. That's real suffering there. And I think, folks who really do care about equality have to pay attention to that too, and acknowledge the reality of that too.
Adam Harris from The Atlantic.
I think my question actually may have been answered in a sort of way, but actually to your point, Philip and Jamar, this is for you as well. Can you just talk about the sort of differences in understanding of the foundations of religion, of Christianity, right? Thinking about like prosperity gospel for those who might have, who say, we used to have these thriving businesses and we're trying to get back to a point of that. But part of that is that we've lost our way. We've lost our religion, right? So thinking about prosperity gospel versus a sort of liberation theology that you talked about, of going back to David Walker's Appeal, going back to sort of those books that are looking at the gospel through a lens of justice, of liberation.
So there's versions of the prosperity gospel in every religion. This sort of transactional, if you do certain things, you'll get certain blessings, especially material, temporal blessings. That's a big topic of conversation in Black church circles and even internationally as we look at the rise of certain brands of Christianity in Africa. So it's present everywhere you go in religious circles. I think one of the things to pay attention to is how historically marginalized communities practice faith. I think that's a big thing. We were talking during the break, like marginalized communities, whether that's because of your race or your religion or your gender or whatever, have to live in this tension between the stated ideals of a community and the lived reality, right? So I think fundamentally, whatever your arguments with the project, I think that's what the 1619 Project was trying to do, is saying, instead of this triumphant version of the founding of the nation with the Declaration of Independence and freedom and liberty from, taxation without representation, what if the founding is much more connected to the reality of the institution of slavery? And then what does the American story or narrative look like from the perspective of the oppressed? Which, by the way, Black people are very patriotic. We have fought in every single war the United States has waged. We fought in wars even when they didn't want us fighting in the war. Like Lincoln didn't want Black people at first to fight in the war, and even the Confederates came around to including Black people when it was like weeks before the end of the war, and they knew that they were going to lose unless they got more people. But that sort of difference between seeing the stated ideals of a nation and holding that in tension with what's really happening is very informative and instructive for us. So that's where I think these white Christian nationalist communities, it's something they refuse to see, something they refuse to acknowledge. It comes across in preaching and teaching and everything like that. And what I'm saying is, why do I keep talking about Black church? It's really Black institutions in general, HBCUs in particular, right? Y'all, the terms of the conversation are so different. It was bracing to me when I was deep in white evangelicalism, the ways we talked about something like Mike Brown versus the ways that all Black settings talked about it. Like, you cannot even conceive how differently it is unless you dip over in and listen into the conversation. So that's all I'm trying to make the case for, is like, we've already ceded the terms of the conversation to one particular group, and there's lots of other groups that have very different ways of thinking about it that could be helpful.
I don't think Jesus was a CEO. I'm just going to leave it at that.
Can figure out, so I'm going to do a mic drop. David Brooks.
Yeah, I'm going to ask for a positive counter-narrative. If we've had the white Christian narrative, what's a positive counter-narrative? And Philip, in this fine book, which I'm holding up, you talked about the tradition of prophetic republicanism. And I was wondering if you, which seemed inspiring to me, but I want to know more about it. And so I was hoping you could give us a Reader's Digest précis of what prophetic republicanism and how it might serve today. And for Jamar, is there a theology of Christian pluralism that is a language and a narrative you could give people that would offer a counter to Christian nationalism?
Yeah, so if I have added one more point to the to-do list at the end of my presentation, it would have been articulating another deep story. I don't think narratives are enough, but I think that narratives are important. And I think they're particularly important at the present moment, because one of the challenges faced by the United States, and not only the United States, is sustaining democratic solidarity in a deeply diverse society. And that's a tall order. I say solidarity, not unity. I don't think that unity is possible or even desirable, but solidarity across deep difference. And I think there are resources within America's cultural and religious history. I mean, the book that David held up, American Covenant, was my kind of deep musing and reflection on trying to identify what at least some of those sources were. And I kind of ended up organizing them under this rubric of prophetic republicanism. And so it's prophetic not in the sense of the book of Revelation. It's prophetic in the sense of the books of Amos, Isaiah, and Jeremiah. It's about a promised land, not in the sense of our birthright, our patrimony that was given to us. It's the promised land in the sense of a march towards a beloved community. So in that sense, it pulls on some of the same biblical sources as Christian nationalism, but it interprets them in a much different way, in a way of interpretation which, as Jamar rightly pointed out, the Black church has played a central role from the beginning in its interpretation of the Exodus story, for example. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that America's political culture has secular sources as well. And these, to me, are less sort of Lockean liberalism, or some people call it classical liberalism, than another kindred tradition that scholars typically call civic republicanism. I'm afraid I'm going to wind up category mongering here if I say too terribly much, but this is an idea of it's really sort of rooted, that really understands that self-government not as a way of forestalling evil, but as something that's inherent to pursuing the human good. That being an active citizen is not just something that you do to defend your rights or achieve your interests, but it's also something that you do in order to form a community that's in pursuit of some ideal of the common good or of ordered liberty, living together. And that one of the things that one sees emerging, I think, in the centuries up to and then certainly including the revolution, is a kind of a synthesis of these two stories. So just as the white Christian nationalist deep story pulls on these different threads, so this sort of prophetic republicanism story pulls on both kind of a secular and religious thread, a kind of biblical prophetic thread, and a thread of classical political philosophy. And I think that you can see that vision being articulated and re-articulated across history by a diverse set of actors. I would just say that the person who inspired me initially to write the book was actually Barack Obama. And then secondarily, my mentor, Bob Bella. Bob Bella had written a famous and rather controversial essay in 1967 called On American Civil Religion, which unleashed a very long debate. And he concluded himself a decade and a half later that the tradition was dead, and yet it lives. You could hear in some of Obama's rhetoric him pulling on those threads, and you could see in the reactions that people had across the political spectrum to his articulation of the American project. You could see that still had resonance. So I think something like that is not only possible, but also necessary, though. I think one thing I learned in writing the book is that probably you need somebody like Jamar, who's got more rhetorical and homiletical talents than me, or Amanda Gorman, somebody who can speak in a kind of a lyrical fashion to articulate. That's the work of poets and pastors, not of sociologists, I think.
David just wants me to articulate a theology of Christian pluralism on the spot. That's easy. So one of the pitfalls of trying to talk about Christian pluralism is when it gets into the hands of some people, it becomes a both sidesism, a false equivalencies, we're all messed up kind of a thing. And what it does is it voids the issue of power dynamics, right? Not all people are doing the same thing or have the same impact. In other words, when I talk about racism, I say, sure, black people have racial prejudice towards other groups. The difference is we didn't have the power to put our prejudices into policy. It's just a historical fact. So it's very different when I can make a law that says you can't use this bathroom, as a very easy example, right? So I'm just that's part of the trickiness of talking about pluralism, especially among Christians. Now, if we were to articulate something like a theology of Christian pluralism, I would think we would have to do a re-excavation and a reimagining of the doctrine of the image of God, or the Imago Dei, found in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 to 28. All people are made in the image and likeness of God, which applies to Christian and non-Christian. It applies whatever your gender or sexuality, it applies whatever your wealth. That's a bare basic foundation. If you're human, you're in God's image. Let's go from there. And I think it's critically important because we live in the most connected time in human history, which puts us in proximity with people who are different from us far more often than ever before. Therefore, we must have a deep and robust understanding of what it means to be human, and therefore how I must treat you and how you must treat me, especially because there's all these lines of differences now. So I think I did a brief essay about that, and Snyder was a wonderful editor, and it's in Comment magazine, on my thoughts about a racial reformation centered around the doctrine of the image of God. Secondly, I think it is also a renewed understanding of the theology of the church. So if we're speaking particularly about Christians, what does it mean to be the people of God? And so in the Bible and in Acts, it calls Christians people of the way, but I think we can also say it's people on the way. And what do I mean by people on the way? We talk about a quiet exodus. We talk about leave loud. Well, what comes after that? A wilderness wandering. A desert time. You're not yet to the promised land. You don't even know how or when you'll get there. But what you do have is other people on the way. And so in my experience, what I've found as a much deeper, richer experience of the church is not this event on Sunday morning, but a gathering of people on the way who have been brought together by their mutual commitment to things like justice and pluralism. And then what you see when you look around at these other people on the way, how the heck did we end up next to each other? You're so different. We're so different. And then it becomes, I guess the true meaning and the true richness of a faith community is not this homogenized vision of who or what we should be. It's that all these disparate people are coming together because they believe in something bigger and beyond. And that's how we understand, I think, in a Christian context, the church in a much deeper level than what we've been used to, which is a very institutionalized, programmatic, event-focused way of understanding what it means to be not just the church, but Christian. And don't get me started, because I think all of this has to do with the theology of money too, but we ain't get there yet.
There's a bar later tonight, and we have money. We'll keep it going. All right, a little bit. Mustafa Akil, please.
Thanks so much. I'm still new in America and learning its culture wars and all the nuances, but I think the point Matt made was important, that there is a feeling of they are coming after our children, and because of some far left elements that want to impose their way of gender and their beliefs in human nature through education, on society. And that's why Dahlia's point was very important. So the 2 points connect. That's why actually some conservative Muslims found an alliance with the conservative Christians in Michigan. And I don't know, that's totally temporary, but there is something new there, right? Maybe in post 9/11, anxiety about Muslims is being replaced by we the traditional people against the focus, which of course, I'm sure there are inherent reasons of Christian nationalism, but it can be filled by some elements on the other side, which is also not pluralist. And so just want to say that as an observation, but I think the two observations connect what Matt said and Dahlia. But I have a question. The Christian nationalism you're describing, so disturbing, it also sounds super similar to me to the Muslim nationalism that runs my home country, Turkey, lately, or Hindu nationalism in India. And I think one argument I make in these cases is to say, look, if you're going to justify this, like you're majoritarian, this is a Hindu country or a Christian country, are you going to justify the consequences of that to your brothers and sisters in religion there when they're a minority? Like if majorities get their way and say, this is our country, we call the shots and impose it, is this a great idea? So what do you think about anti-conversion laws in India that is actually targeting the Christian minority? Or I make the same case for, of course, Muslim majoritarians or supremacists as well. Would this be a strategy to open up minds a little bit? Like the world order you're bringing with all this, this is our country and we call the shots, is actually going to be terrible for your fellow believers somewhere else?
So again, I don't know enough to give an authoritative answer, but I can sort of make a few points here. So you're absolutely right to point out that Christian nationalism is one flavor of religious nationalism, and religious nationalism is resurging all around the world. I'm actually running a series of conferences over this year and next that will bring together folks working on a variety of different religious and regional contexts to think about this, and also to think about the kind of transnational connections and alliances that are emerging between and across these different movements and contexts. Other thing I will say is that I think that there is often a deeper understanding of this, and I'm speaking now about sort of the American context in particular and the Christian context in general, there's a greater awareness of these issues in missionary circles, and that that those today and also historically in the United States have been some of the most powerful voices for a more pluralistic and cosmopolitan understanding of the United States. So there's an excellent book by, for example, by the Berkeley historian David Hollinger called Protestants Abroad that came out a couple of years ago, which it's really amazing that the number of folks who were involved in the creation of the kind of international order that emerges after World War II, how many of them were missionaries' kids, actually, who had been born abroad, schooled abroad, lived abroad, still felt this deep connection to the United States. So, if you're looking for voices like within the Christian churches who could speak with authority about this issue, I think that's where you would find them, actually.
So missionaries are hope for liberal Christianity.
The world's a strange place, full of paradox and riddle and
globalization
irony.
helps somehow.
Yeah.
Touch that, Jamar. Happy. Good. Okay. Christine Emba, Washington Post.
Is this on? Yes. Oh, great. So I'm very interested in kind of almost the first principles that are underlying these movements that often go, if not unstated, perhaps sort of undefined. And I think the first part of my question may have been answered a little bit, but I was wondering if you could talk more about the idea of a nation in this context, and like what constitutes a nation in this movement. Is it actually just ethnic? Is it place? Is it something else? Because I've become interested in, you sort of discussed this, the other groups sort of trying to move into the nation or defending their participation. Like even in the Black church, there's a sort of divide between ADOS and Black people from elsewhere who are not real Americans. And then there's like the idea that the concern with nation in the white Christian nationalist formation actually often seems to overwhelm the Christian part. So you talked about evangelicals who were Trump supporters, but it seems like later in that administration, what you saw was people who identified as evangelical but never actually attended church and like couldn't actually tell you anything about the Bible were the ones who were Trump supporters, not people who were really, really involved in sort of like deep theological thinking. So that's one question, like what is a nation really and how important is that in this movement? And then a follow-on, Jamar, you sort of hinted at this idea of anti-intellectualism. And this is also one of the questions, or sort of a broader question, when we talk about like, how do you convince people that like Christianity is actually pluralist or whatever, when a lot of people in this movement actually don't seem that interested in talking about what Christianity means on a deep theological level or an intellectual level. It seems to operate purely on the level of feeling in a large way. I don't know what you have to say to that.
Philip, I'm curious how you would talk about the nationalism part of white Christian nationalism.
So I guess what I would say is that people often make a distinction, people study this between ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism, and ethnic nationalism is about land and people, or to put it a little bit more provocatively, blood and soil. And civic nationalism is about a civic community or about ideas and institutions. And until about 5 minutes ago, I would say that most Republican and conservative thought leaders were very much on the side of civic nationalism. So they would talk about American values, American ideals, American institutions of democracy, rule of law, and so on and so forth. And it's really over the last, during the Trump years that I've noticed this shift in language, and sometimes quite explicit. Sort of both established thought leaders like Rod Dreher, up-and-coming thought leaders like Nate Hochman will say, well, no, America is not an idea, it's a place, right? And they won't quite come out and talk about blood. They probably don't really believe that, but what they will talk about is culture. So a phrase I suddenly hear echoing around a lot is Anglo-Protestant culture, that America's dominant culture is Anglo-Protestant. So that's clearly, for me at least, marks a shift from a civic idea of nationhood to an ethno-cultural idea of nationhood. And, as you can hear in the Anglo-Protestant, I mean, it's clearly one that I wouldn't even call it a racial subtext, right? I mean, it's clearly racially marked about, who was here first, quote unquote, and, who should be sitting on top of the hierarchy.
So this concept of nation, that's a really interesting one because lots of different groups have concepts of nation. And when I think of movements like Black nationalism, or even there's a book called Black Christian Nationalism by Albert Clegg Jr. written in the 70s. It's mostly about probably the civic portion and self-determination and political power, particularly in the face of disenfranchisements, civil and human rights abuses. So that is a critical question, I think, the relationship between nation and nationalism and white Christian nationalism. But again, this is part of the slipperiness of this entire conversation, is that the same word can mean vastly different things to different people, which is part of how we're talking past one another in a lot of these cases. You also mentioned about anti-intellectualism. It's just so interesting how scholars, Philip and I for two examples, but many, many others, who went to school forever for this and spent a lot of money to do it, and write books about this and study it in a disciplined manner and subject our work to peer review, we're not seen as credible. And it's almost precisely because of those credentials in some cases, because the academy in general has been labeled as sort of a bastion of far left, liberal, progressive ideas that is not only unfriendly but hostile to conservatism. And whatever you might think about that, what it results in is it's very difficult to have a conversation about this in a disciplined manner because the tools of that disciplined discourse are distrusted, or at least the people trying to have that disciplined discourse are distrusted. And then it's not left a vacuum. So if you don't read books like The Flag and the Cross, it's not that you're not reading all the time, it's you're reading something else, or you're going to some other source. Very pseudo-scientific. If you go to, so pop culture is very instructive here. If you go to Amazon, they have all these different categories and they rank the books and whatnot. If you look at the Christian social issues category, it's very telling about what people are reading. And it's books like The Case for Christian Nationalism, or to your point on the prophetic tradition, prophetic forecast is one of them. There's just a lot there. Eric Metaxas's book, Letter to the American Church, biblical critical theory, right? So what I'm saying is, if you distrust these sort of books by academics, it's not that there's something that fills the vacuum. And it's almost pseudo-scientific. And it really reminds me of like the pseudoscience behind race in the 19th century, right? There's just things about the size of a cranium and the physical features indicating your closeness to God and your level of intelligence and level of beauty. And it was all couched in this sort of scientific academic jargon that was really by fringe people who didn't know what the heck they were talking about. And that hasn't gone away completely.
Riata Akio from New Lines Magazine.
Hi. Do you hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. I think Mr. Gorski responded a little bit to my question, which was going to be about differences and similarities in international contexts. And I am very curious about it because if you speak about continuous appeals of Christian nationalism, I have firsthand experience with genocidal appeal in former Yugoslavia of Christian nationalism and different arguments that were used, white Christian nationalism. And in that specific context, we see today, even almost 30 years afterwards, how Bosnian genocide serves as an inspiration for white Christian nationalists, so that we have Brenton Tarrant, so that we have Anders Breivik, and the language and the terminology, which I'm very curious to hear in terms of these differences and the arguments that are used. Because specifically what Jamar just said about what is it that they read. They read war criminals, inspirational texts that serve as a continuous inspiration. And so I'm curious so far in terms of your knowledge, or maybe this is some new conferences that you're working on, about these arguments and language and terminology that's used in Hungary today, in Serbia, in United States, and these connections, because I just had to pull up a quote. For example, Breivik made this Balkans connection specifically quoting and praising
the terrorists. You can remember. I mean, the
terrorists. Yes.
Context.
Yes. The terrorist in Norway. He said, Karadzic, for his efforts to rid Serbia of Islam, will always be remembered as an honorable crusader and a European war hero. So I have to inject a sobering, depressing, and frightening element of European context of white Christian nationalism, and the fact that I think that Dalia's question and point was very important about Islam and anti-Muslim arguments being a driving force in terms of arguments and obsessions about great replacement, culture, and race. So I'm happy that you're doing these conferences. I'm very curious to hear any comments about the differences or similarities in terms of terminology or arguments in this international context.
So if I'm really looking over, the complete set of religious nationalist movements, insofar as I have control over that set, and looking for common denominators, there are certainly a couple that I would point to. So one is blood rhetoric. Blood is an extremely important metaphor because it connects lineage, sacrifice, martyrdom, war, in some contexts, of course, also salvation, right? So it's an incredibly powerful metaphor. And you can see religious nationalists rifling through whatever religious tradition they're a part of in search of it. Mm-hmm. A similar one is apocalyptic rhetoric. I think here one of the most remarkable examples is actually Buddhist nationalism in Sri Lanka. So here you found, people think of, Buddha, at least in the West, tend to think of, Buddhism as being this religion of peace and harmony and so on. And you haven't met enough monks, is what I would say, in Southeast Asia, if you think that. But what they sort of pulled this idea of the sons of the soil, where they emphasize the birth of the Buddha and the Pali Canon and its origins in Lanka. And they sort of reconfigured the idea of these sort of karmic cycles in terms of more apocalyptic cycles. And which is when you sort of merge that apocalyptic rhetoric and that blood rhetoric, that's where you start to find this combustible mixture that can actually spark acts of physical violence and terrorism. So if you really want to understand that fringe, I would actually even describe those as sort of the two warning lights. You know, when you start to see that sort of rhetoric, and you know, in the context of people who are organized and have guns, then you need to start worrying that there's just going to be violence. And I think that's why, you know, to return to your original question, that you do find this sort of strange kinds of kinship and similarity, you know, in rhetoric and positioning across these different extremist terrorists. I mean, you know, find similar talk amongst, you know, ISIS recruits too. Very, you know, pulling on the same kind of apocalyptic rhetoric and blood sacrifice rhetoric.
All right, we got a few more. Tim Dalrymple, Mustafa Akhil, and Molly Ball. No, just go down to two. Tim, you're up, and that'll tee up eventually this afternoon.
Great, thanks. So, Jamar, I have two questions again, and the first is maybe primarily for you, Jamar. I was struck by your comment about the congregation that you led and the individuals who kind of wanted to bring you into their project, otherwise they were going to take their tithe and go, and ultimately led to the dissolution of the congregation. I'm on the board of the Council of Christian Colleges and Universities, which represents about 180 different institutions of Christian higher education, and a lot of them are facing kind of the same economic pressures, right? Of either you get on board with this. If you're not on board with Trumpism or with Christian nationalism, then I'm taking my donor dollars and going, right? And so I think right now in this hyper-polarized, fragmented environment, there's a lot of pressure toward the extremes. And within the evangelical space, which mostly ranges from center-right to right, that's going to be mostly toward the hard right. So I'm curious, Rupert Murdoch gave us this pungent quote about it's not about red or blue, but green. I'm curious how you think about the incentive structures and just the economics of white Christian nationalism. When you see somebody like an Eric Metaxas, who you mentioned, in some ways, it's a great way to make a lot of money, right? And so I'm just concerned about this sort of incentive structures. How do we build bulwarks against that? And the question for you, Philip, is about social media and just what ways that this kind of balkanized media landscape and the rise of virality culture and social media might inflect this particular efflorescence of Christian nationalism differently than prior ones.
As a historian, most of the instances of compromise and complicity when it comes to racism have had something to do with this prospect of losing money or gaining more money, oftentimes both. So in 1667, the Virginia Assembly, which was a group of white Anglican men, so Christians, made a law that said if you're baptized and you are Native American, African, or mixed race, it would not emancipate you. And they were responding to concerns from plantation owners that European missionaries would preach the gospel to enslaved persons, and it would give them all these wacky ideas about equality and liberty and freedom. And they said, no, 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 you can't do that. And the Virginia Assembly said, okay, we're going to resolve this issue between plantation owners and missionaries and say, go ahead, missionaries, you can preach the gospel, but you have to make it clear to the enslaved that this is only spiritual liberation. It has nothing to do with your material, physical condition, right? In the 1790s, Baptists made gestures at being anti-slavery, actually passed a resolution about it. And then in Baptist polity, it goes out to the individual churches for discussion and adoption. Well, it got out to the individual churches, and then plantation owners were like, no, 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 we can't be anti-slavery because that's going to ruin my business. When you go to the Civil War, every Confederate state came up with something called the Articles of Secession, that outline the reasons why they separated from the Union. Mississippi's is very telling. Despite its reputation, Mississippi wasn't the first state to secede. That was South Carolina. But Mississippi came after with this beautiful, eloquent articulation of why they wanted to separate from the Union and said, our cause is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest on the face of the earth. And it goes on to talk about commerce and production and things of that nature. Then we get up to contemporary times. You see now, for instance, Christian colleges and universities, some of them branding themselves proactively and positively as far right and what we would label Christian nationalists. I would put Grove City College, Hillsdale College, Palm Beach Atlantic, which I referenced earlier, and several others in that camp. Because they see it as the future of their institution in terms of getting students to enroll in tuition dollars and donations. Or conversely, losing it because they become labeled as woke. So that's why I say this theology of money thing. And here's where it gets really deep on a moral level and a level of integrity. I think in the United States in particular, we have this idea of a successful church, which is big in every kind of way. Big in terms of the number of people who attend and big in terms of a bank account. And I wonder if part of the sifting in the church is saying, big isn't always better. Successful isn't necessarily the way we should be framing this versus a healthy faith community, a faith community that has faithfulness to its ideas. And guess what? Most of the time, those are not the biggest, richest churches. So the reality is, I think we're going to have to become a lot more comfortable with losing budgets and buildings in favor of fidelity to the one we say we follow.
Tim, quickly,
social media as giving traction.
Social media, yeah. So again, I guess you're discovering is typical for me, a kind of a global observation, which is that periods of transformation in the media of communication often lead to periods of breakdown in cultural authority, which in turn give rise to political turmoil. The Reformation is a great example, deeply connected to the invention of the printing press. If you look at the authoritarian movements of the late 19th, early 20th century, you know, Nazism, Soviet communism, kind of the signature examples, not really thinkable without radio, public address systems, stadiums, all really key to the success of those movements. And so we shouldn't be surprised, you know, that social media is causing as much turmoil as it does, because you know, at least some of us in the room, myself certainly, are old enough to remember, you know, the age, the period when there were 3 major networks, and that was kind of boring, but, you know, and there weren't huge differences between what they reported every night, but there was a sort of a factual baseline that that people shared and could refer to. And there was, of course, all this optimism with social media that it would be democratizing, and I suppose in a very generic sense of opening up the gates of the public square to everybody it was. But of course, a lot of the folks who slipped through the gates came in with megaphones and grifting ambitions. So, you know, it maybe played a role in the Arab Spring, but it also played a role in InfoWars. And, you know, I think that is absolutely, some of the, circle back to this early question about QAnon and yoga moms and the New Apostolic Reformation. I don't think that that cocktail could have been mixed without social media. So I think it is crucial, and even though it's maybe a thing that I'm not supposed to say. I think part of getting out of moments like this is the reemergence of some forms of widely recognized cultural authority. Again, gatekeepers, that doesn't mean some cabal of people who all agree about everything, but it does mean some folks who, within various institutional spheres and contexts, are able to sort of set the parameters, at least, of the debate and rule some things just out of court, so that you wouldn't have prominent politicians flirting with white nationalists the way that you do. And again, that just George H.W. Bush would have shut that down in a second. But there's nobody who's able or willing to do that right now, because it's also affected, of course, the political parties. You have this kind of iron triangle or doom loop connecting, the Republican base, quote unquote, with conservative media and social media, with Republican politicians, and it's just this endless loop that leads to greater and greater radicalization, and there's nobody, with a breaker switch right now. No authority with the breaker switch.
Malika Bilal hosts The Take with Al Jazeera.
Kind of following up on that, the no breaker switch, that might be the answer to this question. But Jamar, you referenced that New York Times article, so that was 2018. 2 years later, the killing of George Floyd and what many in my community, aka the journalism community, would call the racial reckoning. And this is America taking a look at itself inwardly. But then fast forward to today, the end of 2022, 2023, and you're seeing the erasure of certain sections of AP African American history. You're seeing the firing of the professor in your anecdote. Was that an inevitable backlash to the racial reckoning, if you do agree that that's what happened in 2020? And then if so, what happens next? What's the backlash to that backlash?
Very good. So 2 minutes. One of the things that I say is a movement is not only measured by the progress it makes, but by the resistance it faces. So in some ways, we can look at this resurgence of white Christian nationalism and all these things as a nod to, well, this was working. It was making a difference. I mean, the state flag in Mississippi finally came down. That was a big deal. I have 2 degrees from schools in the state of Mississippi. The other way I think about it is the default in our country is toward authoritarianism and anti-democracy. And so it's really a marvel that any of these sort of freedom movements gain traction at all. And the last thing I'll say is change takes a long time. That's one of the things that history helps give a perspective on. It's like people have been doing this since the slave ships, right? But that doesn't mean, because I don't think that the only value of a social movement is a changed law or policy. I think the value of a social movement, and more broadly, pursuing justice and truth and goodness, is how it changes us. And that's what I look to for encouragement and perseverance as we go. The kind of people we become in pursuit of good things.
I'm just going to add a sociological point, and uncharacteristic for sociological points, an optimistic point, which is that one of the best predictors for the success of democratic movements is that they have persevered over a long period of time. And this is kind of the opposite of collectivism. It is that the building up of ties, relationships, organizations, narratives within civil society. And I think that it's the existence and the resilience of those movements, including certainly, first and foremost, the Black liberation movement, that has made American democracy resistant so far to the sort of worst threats that it's been facing in recent years, I think, to many people's surprise, including mine.
All right, how about a closing question from Molly Ball? Time.
No pressure. We've heard a lot about the divides over gender and sexuality fueling this. And indeed, in fact, in addition to race, there does seem to be a deep investment in traditional gender hierarchies and family roles that are part of what connect these movements across national and cultural and even racial borders. What is the role of women in this Christian nationalist movement that we're seeing today, both in numeric and sort of individual terms?
Just when a little question about social media opened up a new can of worms. Come on. Role of women in the larger.
My usual response to this question is, have you read Jesus and John Wayne? Which I'm sure you have. The reason we don't talk as much about the role of gender in the flag and the cross is because Christian Nationalism did it so well in that book. But you are right to highlight that also as the common denominator that runs across a lot of these movements. Internationally, across religious lines, and that also connects them with secular nationalist movements, which are also often, very, very strongly patriarchal. And so I do think that inevitably, the pushback will, in large part, come from women in these, in these denominations and traditions. Though I think maybe you were asking a somewhat trickier question about why would a woman be a member of a patriarchalist movement? Was that really your question?
I'd be interested in that, but I was more curious about, like, in some of the polling you cited, like, is this in fact a male-dominated, movement or ideology, and are there, individual women leaders who are prominent figures in it?
You certainly, in the leadership of the movement, and also in the followership of the movement, definitely see that it skews male. There are exceptions to this rule. Take Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example. But of course, she's a tough lady who lifts weights and does other things that, there's a kind of performative masculinity about her public persona. But it certainly is, in that sense, kind of a masculinist and patriarchal movement, no doubt about it. And that's something that, again, cuts across borders.
Good to go?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, gentlemen, very much. That's great. Thank you. All right, just a super quick teeing up. There's lunch awaits us. It's on the same area where we had breakfast, and it's already served. If you get bored this afternoon, can I nudge two articles that Pete Wehner has written recently in The Atlantic? I think one is called "Vengeance is Trump's," which gets a lot of the questions you were raising, Jamar, about forbearance, and the other is the one that brought us to Philip Yancey, a piece that he wrote in 2021, something like how Philip Yancey thinks about life and death and grace, or something like that. So he's the guy to read. He hasn't said anything yet, but looking forward to hosting you both when we get back at 1 o'clock sharp in this room. Bon appetit.